Well, certainly the evidence of tradition or traditional beliefs about these matters would suggest that we need to take seriously the notion of disembodied or disincarnate intelligences that somehow have an interest in human fate and human nature. Traditionally, they've been conceived of as guardians or messengers from some higher entity in the universe. I'm not sure whether that function holds up under inspection. In my own experience with shamanic cultures and with hallucinogenic substances, there certainly is, especially with the tryptamine hallucinogens, the very strong impression of contact with disincarnate entities that are aware and interested in the human condition. They don't map easily over any of the traditional forms of disincarnate entities, which include not only angels, but gnomes, fairies, water spirits, plant spirits, ancestors, all of these things. I think angel is simply a term to let us in to the concept that at least in these states of perturbed mind that accompany shamanic intoxication, there is a sense of interaction with a transhuman agency. And this has probably been going on for thousands and thousands of years. It's astonishing to us as moderns because the last 500 years have been spent very carefully building the case for the denial of anything beyond the surface of ordinary appearances. Nevertheless, direct experience of these things, which I believe is accessible to most people through the use of shamanic techniques and substances, is easily achieved. What we as moderns are to make of this, I'm not sure. I mean, I suppose we could discuss the message or messages, because there are many claimants to true knowledge of the intent of these invisible entities. My own experience suggests that somehow they are concerned with the development of language and communication. I mean, my own experiences are of something like language elves or entities in some kind of psychological superspace that are trying to coax human beings into ever more realized poetic self-expression, almost as though language is the privileged dimension in which we're able to interact with these things. That's just a very short gloss on the notion of angels or disincarnate entities with an interest in human nature and human fate. Gentlemen?
Yes, perhaps we could leave a second round for the messages of what, and the first would be, do they exist?
Well, can we pause a minute and discuss the process? That's what I wanted to say. I wanted to discuss the process before.
I think the interesting thing about angels is that so many people see them. These surveys, like the Gallup poll, which are carried out in Britain and America regularly, asking people about paranormal or unusual experience, show an amazingly high figure for people meeting angels. About 60% of the people surveyed claimed that they've had some experience of angels, some sense of the presence of angels. I mean, it's an amazingly high figure, given the very secular nature of our society. So I think that the sense of angels, at least as guardians and as messengers of some kind, or as guides, is still very strong. I can't say that I've ever seen an angel myself, although I've had various forms of guidance which I suppose I could think of as coming from angels. But the main way I find I can think about angels is as intelligences in the natural world, and possibly as well in the supernatural world. But there's so much of the natural world that we don't understand. The idea of intelligences, for example, within the sun and the stars, seems to me one very good locus for angels. This is what was believed in the Middle Ages, that these stars and the planets were animate. And of course, it's easy for us to take on board the idea of the Earth as animate in the light of the Gaia hypothesis. But if they're animate, then the question arises, are they conscious, and do they have some kind of intelligence? And so I find it relatively easy to think of the sun as having a kind of mind of its own, the complex electromagnetic patterns sustaining some kind of mental activity, some kind of intelligence. And the traditional term used in Europe for these forms of celestial intelligence would be the angels.
Well, I think my view on this is closer to Terence's, and that would be appropriate as 60%. See, we're about 2/3. My students last month were reading about angels, and I heard them say, they didn't believe anything about angels, so they were part of that other 40%. And to drive home the point, one said, "Who in this room has seen an angel?" I raised my hand without thinking, and I looked around. It was the only hand up. I do feel that I've seen an angel. But my angels, like Terence's, are different from the classical reports in the literature with the wings, the guardian, and so on. I was very struck with Mohammed the Prophet, his angel. It was Angel Gabriel that appeared to him with all the wings and everything, and gave him very careful instructions what was to happen, and he did go and carry them out. I haven't seen that kind of angel, but I believe that all the reports in literature, well, some people just lie, but there are a lot of authentic experiences are reported in the literature with poetic license, which is very exceptional. You have to ask yourself, why do the reports differ so much from the experience, if they do? Or do you think that people have really seen an angel with wings that talks to them like a person? So my angel, what I think is something in my experience that could possibly be what they're talking about in these anecdotal reports, is an apparent entity in a field of intelligence that is contacted in an extraordinary state that seems to communicate things that I don't know, showing that it's not actually part of myself. And as I explain to my students, these intelligences are sometimes, they don't look like anything like a being. For example, they may be disconnected. They vibrate over here and over there. Their communication is in some kind of space-time patterns, usually not speech. But if I try to tell you what happened, then I might say an angel spoke to me. Discarnate, intelligent, knowing things I don't know, loving in favor of health, happiness, and actually evolution, giving evolution a nudge, that kind of information, divine information, communicated as it were, using everything necessary, sign language and so on.
Well, of course, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was, together with Charles Darwin, developed natural selection, believed that the entire evolutionary process was being given nudges by angels. He thought of intelligences guiding each species. So it wasn't just for him a matter of guardian angels for human beings, but guardian angels for cockroaches and guardian angels for goldfish and so on. Each giraffes and camels, they all had their own guardian angels. Now, he didn't go into the question of whether the guardian angel for camels looked like a camel or not. But he did have the idea of some kind of intelligence, which he thought the best term was angel, the traditional term, was involved in guiding the evolutionary process. I find it hard to imagine what kind of entities these could be, but if one thinks that evolution is anything but blind chance, then there must be some kind of intelligence involved, and it's hard to conceive what kind of intelligence it might be, but Alfred Russel Wallace had a go in this idea, and I think he was very brave to do so.
It's probably worth pointing out that in spite of the fact that science is very unfriendly to angels, there there is anecdotal evidence that science was founded by an angel. The famous visitation to Descartes, in which he was, as a young man, told the conquest of nature will be accomplished through number and measure. This is an extraordinary example of history itself being radically affected by an angelic visitation, similar to the angelic visitation to Mohammed that Ralph mentioned. So I think it's wrong to assume that the angels confine their activities to the world of religion, mysticism, and the spirit. Apparently what they are interested in is pushing forward the human exploration of the infinite. And why this should be so is at this moment opaque, but certainly their founding role in modern science makes this highly suggestive.
Yes, Rupert mentioned angel in context with the intelligence of the sun, and I was thinking about evolution, that the so-called evolution of the solar system, that means the motion of the planets around their tracks. This is not necessarily regular according to science. I mean, science doesn't have a good enough model to explain the regularity of the solar system or even its very existence. So Newton believed that God essentially set things back on their course annually. To keep things going required intervention from God that could be interpreted, as it were, as the angel of the sun, giving the necessary instructions for evolution to the solar system. So the sun rises in the morning and sets at night. Even something this basic is the responsibility of the guardian angel of the solar system.
And who is the guardian now?
It's the same now.
I think that's enough on angels.
That's much.
Yes. Yes, the place where these creatures, or how should we tell them, not hominoids, but they are angeloids.
Heaven. Since the 17th century, there's been a great split in the sense of the heavens. Before the 17th century, when people used the word heaven, they were referring both to the sky and to the abode of God, the angels, and the blessed. Since the 17th century, the sky, the heavens, have been secularized, and there's been the idea that the heavens are simply the domain of astronomy, where there are stars, planets, comets, and so forth. Whereas the heavenly state, the abode of the angels, God, and the blessed, is some kind of psychological state, a state of being which has nothing whatever to do with the actual sky. It's not located out there, it's located in here in some way, or in some other realm, the spiritual realm, utterly disconnected from the sky. Now we've grown used to this, so that if you suggest to a Christian, for example, that when they say, Our Father who art in heaven, that this implies that God is located in the sky, they very rapidly become embarrassed by this suggestion and brush it aside as some kind of childish naivete. And yet, when Jesus first brought that prayer through and told people about that prayer, and when people prayed to God in heaven, they were not thinking that the sky was totally irrelevant, that the abode of God was somewhere else in some kind of purely subjective realm. They saw the two as related. And I think that it's important to recover that sense of relationship between heaven in the traditional sense of a state of being or a place where human spirits may go or other spirits dwell, and the actual sky that we see. The idea that the whole of the sky is devoid of any spiritual presence or meaning is the most grotesque and exaggerated secularization in the history of science, or indeed human thought. The skies make up 99.999 recurring % of what there is, the earth being a very small part. If God is everywhere, then obviously the vast majority of God is in the sky. So on a purely quantitative argument, we can say that the dwelling place of God and heavenly beings is not likely to be on earth, but rather in the sky. So this is, first of all, important, I think, to recover a sense of the life of the heavens. We now have the view of the cosmos as a kind of developing organism. I think it's perfectly possible to think of the stars and galaxies and solar systems throughout the rest of the universe as having a kind of life of their own, a kind of intelligence of their own. So we can recover a sense, I think, of the life of the heavens, and presumably of an intelligence within the heavens related to perhaps to the traditional view of angels in some way. There's also the question of the heavenly state. In various traditions, the heavenly state is imagined in all sorts of ways. All Christians and Muslims believe in the existence of heaven. I suppose Jews do too. But they're awfully vague and evasive when it comes to saying exactly what it is. And the cartoon image of angels sitting on clouds playing harps gives us several indications. One is that it's dynamic, since clouds move. Secondly, that it's not confined to normal laws of gravity, otherwise the angel would sink through them. And thirdly, that it involves some kind of musical or vibratory nature. And different cultures have different images of heaven, but I've been very struck in Terence's descriptions of the state of mind induced by DMT, dimethyltryptamine, that this and perhaps other psychoactive substances can produce a state which in many ways seems to resemble the state of heavenly bliss portrayed in religious literature. This is in fact a wide open field for speculation, because even those who think that it's merely subjective and don't locate these states in any way in the sky or outside ourselves find it hard to describe them, and it would be very hard to separate them from some states to which psychoactive substances might open doors.
Yes, probably the Islamic conception of paradise is the most concrete and graspable, because it accentuates sensual pleasure, beauty. It's the idea of life as a kind of Mughal potentate with all desires fulfilled. More abstract versions of heaven seem to imply, as Rupert said, a passing of the human form into higher and higher states of vibration. Heaven apparently has the character of music of some sort. It's a Pythagorean realm. It's a realm of color and light that is in transformation. And I believe that the closest we on this side of the grave can get to these kinds of states is through the perturbation of ordinary brain states with the kind of compounds that have been mentioned, dimethyltryptamine. There seems to be a kind of looking over the great divide into another order of existence. It's almost as though what we see there is life in the untrammeled imagination. Heaven is a kind of world without physics, where there is no exhaustion, where there is no energy debt to be paid. This implies that it's a kind of superconducting world, an eternal world, a world without attrition, entropy, or the possibility of wearing out or running down. It's a world ever new. There is no wear and tear in heaven. Time seems to be transcended in some way, or perceived as a kind of immediate wholeness. Heaven is associated with the idea of eternity and prolongation of human life into immortality. So it's a fulfillment of all of the dreams of overcoming the limitations of three-dimensional space, but it's also more. It's a kind of presupposition of a transcendental form of beauty, a platonic ideal of beauty which somehow informs this other dimension and gives it meaning. And in that sense, it seems to me it's a very laudable image for a culture to produce and carry around with it. Heaven is the land of the just. It's the place of lost innocence. And as long as a culture has this ideal in some form, I think there's an impetus to moral behavior and the promotion of caring and community values. So whether heaven exists or not, it is seen to be as a necessary part of social psychology, a necessary part of the tools that the personality carries around with it, because it permits hope of a transcendental sort. And in the secular world of the 20th century, of course, this is denigrated and denied, but the consequence of that is a kind of hopelessness, a kind of alienation, and worse, an effort to build a heaven of commodity overproduction in three-dimensional space, which has very much the contrary effect. The effort to build heaven on earth has over and over throughout history created various kinds of political hells. So heaven is apparently an ideal best left to its realization in a realm beyond three-dimensional space and time.
Rupert, I liked your idea to resacralize the sky, but I like better the idea of heaven as a personal state. There could be an analogy, however, in that the personal exploration of the seven heavens does seem to have a geometry like the sky. But my view of this, like Terence's, I think is more in the context of an inner space voyage, and I must admit has been strongly influenced by my experiences with DMT. I think that the Merkaba mystics, these were Jews that did inner pilgrimage before the time of Christ. They had a kind of paradox that people have puzzled over about going up to heaven by going down. And I think that what this meant was the pilgrimage was undertaken in the basement because it was quiet there. There was a special chamber for meditation, and one actually went up, that is, to the inner heavens by going down, that is, to the meditation room. It does seem that the exploration of the psychic universe could be described geometrically as a sequence of concentric spheres, and that one had to accomplish one of them, become comfortable, return home, go back a few times, and upon getting this level well practiced to then achieve another one, and so on. There arises the question, though, whether this inner heaven is actually the one that people mean when they say God in heaven. There it could be...
Well, I'd reject the idea of inner and outer in its usual sense. And we're the victims of a humanistic culture that tells us that the whole of the external world is desacralized matter in motion, the province of the natural sciences, whereas religion, psychology, and art is to do with the inner world, which implicitly is supposed to reside somewhere inside our brains, and hence to decay when our brains decay. So heaven would, in that case, be something you might enter through mystical states while you're alive, or drug states. Certainly not somewhere you go when you die, because if heaven's an inner state inside the brain, then that would decay with everything else. And I think the idea that inner states are actually inside our bodies is one of the false dichotomies set up by Cartesian-type thinking. I myself think that when we look at the stars, in some sense our mind reaches out to touch the star. That when we look around us, our minds are reaching out to fill the room or the place in which we are. And that although it's an inner perception, it's to do with our psychology, the inner is actually outer as well. And therefore, I wouldn't reject the idea out of hand that heavenly states are not located. I would take seriously the idea that heavenly states might be located at places other than inside our cerebral cortex or inside our
Well, didn't mean that the mind is contained in the brain, and I didn't really think the word inner was appropriate to describe this journey. Nevertheless, it could be that conflating these two views of heaven and putting them in the sky is incorrect. It could be that there are sort of different dimensions of outer or other, and that the
well, why not consider the idea that the two are conflated? I mean, we're so
Okay.
quick to reject it that it's worth considering. What if certain kinds of heavenly state are located in a particular galaxy or solar system, others in others, and as Jesus says in the Gospels, in my Father's house are many mansions. Well, it may be that these refer to all sorts of celestial abodes or celestial realms, which in the twinkling of an eye we may go to in our dreams, visions, or even DMT experiences. And the idea that a DMT-induced state is necessarily interior, implying in the brain, may be wrong. It may be that these drugs or mystical states in general open doors so that we can travel or see things that are actually far...
I agree. That describes the experience I've had. There is a feeling of going out in a voyage psychically, and that's why these concentric spheres, and as I said, it looks like heaven, it feels like heaven. It could be the sky, it could be the celestial sphere. But this is, well, one problem I have with this is the implication that the entire realm is actually real estate. I mean, that it's three-dimensional. Because we think it's more than three-dimensional.
It could be located in space and still not exactly be three-dimensional. I think what I hear Rupert implying is something like the traditional Polynesian idea that to get to heaven you have to swim through the spiral of the galaxy. Their notion then is that the galactic center is a kind of heaven, and that the physical universe, in this case the galaxy, is actually organized as a series of concentric shells of ever more rarefied spirit, I suppose you would have to say.
So heaven is exactly 300 kiloparsecs away. That's what you mean. That's great.
This is entirely entertainable.
All right. Well, if we would keep me happy by adding a couple more dimensions to wherever we are, then I think, this would explain the possible confusion between UFOs and angels. And it would explain a lot of things, and it would also present us with astrology as a navigational aid to reach the many rooms in the mansion of God.
Yes, it's a kind of amalgam of medieval scholasticism and the eccentric yearnings of the New Age mentality.
And the Chaldean astrology.
Yes, a curious amalgam of literalism and transcendentalism that ends up by transforming the physical universe into the spiritual universe by co-mapping the two geographies over each other.
Now, leaving aside the question of the individual death and the journey of the soul to heaven or wherever, let me ask you, what will happen then to the mansion of God, heaven, in the case of a physical collapse of the universe? The celestial sphere is contracted to a point. Does that end, then, the real estate of God?
Don't you think that's a little speculative?
Yes, I do.
Well, I think that we don't need to concern ourselves with that particular question. And maybe that would bring us to another question
beyond this point.
Of the spiritual heaven and the celestial heaven, even with added dimensions, there arises a question as to the location of God's actual throne at the moment of creation. That's what I'm talking about. If God occupies a throne in the eighth heaven, and the eighth heaven is part of the 99% of the physical universe, which hasn't been created yet, then I have a logical problem similar to the many concerns of early Christianity and early Islam that is solved by dissociating the mansion of God and the physical universe.
It's too easy a solution. You see, we have every model we have of entities within the universe has some kind of center. You know, the cell has a nucleus, the electron has a nucleus, the solar system has the sun, the galaxy has a galactic center, and so do other galaxies. Clusters of galaxies exist, and then there are mysterious things in space like the Great Attractor, towards which huge clusters of galaxies all seem to be moving. And the idea that the entire cosmos has some kind of center seems to me very likely in the light of but just by extending this way of thinking on microcosm and macrocosm parallels. It may be something that astronomers haven't paid much attention to. It may be beyond present observational possibilities. But the idea that there's some kind of nucleus of the whole cosmos, a special point of power within it, seems to me very likely. The idea that spiritual and physical mappings have to be in other domains is again something I would reject. And if you look at, for example, traditional views of pilgrimage, Muslims go to Mecca. Well, there's Mecca, it's real estate in the sense when you go, you buy an aeroplane ticket to go there, it's located on a map. And yet the meaning and spiritual value of going there, which Muslims believe is great, is not something which is totally separable from the physical location. The same is true of great places of pilgrimage in Europe, the great cathedrals and so on, places like Santiago de Compostela. These are geographically located and yet have particular spiritual power, property, or whatever. Now it seems to me perfectly possible the same is true of the sky, of the heavens. And we have to remember also that in the various traditions there are not only good entities or intelligences located in the heavens, but bad ones too, ones that involve the spirit of negation, satanic principles and so forth. Well, what about black holes as their abode? They're supposed to be cast into utter darkness. Well, if one wanted to populate the heavens as conceived, not by Laplacian mechanics, but by modern cosmology, there are all sorts of astonishing entities and things there just crying out for speculative activity, quasars, galactic centers, black holes. The idea that the whole of this domain should be left entirely blank from a spiritual or psychic point of view, and everything else somehow crammed implicitly into the human brain, seems to me an extraordinary division, and one that we don't need to live with any longer if we choose to move beyond it.
Well, besides the problem that the galactic center is apparently a black hole, I think that this would require that bishops and clerics in general have a PhD in astronomy. But actually, I agree with you. I think that to adopt the AA roadmap as an essential equipment for a spiritual pilgrim is good. Spiritual pilgrims should travel in the physical universe and experience their journeys anywhere. I would say the roadmap and the DMT. What do you think, Terence?
It sounds good to me. You're dismissing the center of the galaxy as a black hole. You have to remember what lies at the center of a black hole is a singularity. And a singularity is as close as astrophysics gets
to the throne of God.
You've got it.
All right. I think we've come to a consensus here. I like it.
They wanted me, that was the question they wanted. But now
Okay, well, we'll do this all briefly then.
No, we'll do the soul as energy.
We lose a little bit of time with the editing.
The soul. Well, the soul is used, this word, in so many ways. So let me admit two for our consideration right now, and that is the world soul and the individual soul, let us say in the perspective of Plato or the Neoplatonists. In fact, let's just think about the world soul first, because that is more important for us politically at the moment to understand the world soul, as the concern with the individual soul is so egocentric and selfish and characteristic of the humanist universe. So the world soul is an idea from ancient times, primarily about the planet Earth in the geocentric model of Plato. So we have now a world that we walk around which is completely devoid of anything except energy and matter. And the mechanical deadness of the world is a frustration for probably most people walking on it, except perhaps for a few devoted scientists. The resurrection of the world soul of ancient times is not so easy, however, because we don't have the daily experience of it. We have to figure out what the soul meant in order to resurrect it. So the extrapolation from our experience of personal soul is probably going to be insufficient to try to guess the feeling of the soul of the world. I think the soul of the world is better approached maybe from Rupert's notion of the morphogenetic field. There is, if there is more to the universe than energy and matter, then it must be organized in a number of interpenetrating fields which are non-physical, which are not the ordinary fields. And if the energy and matter materialize around these fields, then there is within each rock, each room, each automobile, each radio station and radio wave an immaterial version which is alive and intelligent and which serves, as it were, as the guardian angel of that part in maintaining the connection of all of everything that gives it the wholeness, which is the universe that we know. That without this classical field, the world soul, essentially the dead parts of the universe would simply fly apart. No matter the gravitational field, the electromagnetic field, the nuclear fields, and so on, it wouldn't be held together in form unless there were a forming field. So there's an attempt to guess the personality of the world soul coming out of a culture which has denied its existence. Nobody's going to be convinced by this kind of attempt, though, unless they could have some experience of the world soul themselves. So without wishing that a scientist would take over this realm of the attempt to define the nature and properties of the world soul by experiment, I would like to suggest some kind of experiments that ordinary people could do, including us, to come in contact with the actuality of the world soul, whether in rocks, in stars, in the sun, in the regularity of the solar system, in the emergence of life, in the integrity of the biosphere, and so on. Probably the general idea that people have for the resurrection of the world soul is the integrity of the biosphere and the consciousness of it that's created by the threat of its death. So what do you think about this experimental approach?
So that the auditor...
No, I don't know the experiment. But we're looking for some experiments here, and I have in mind my own experience, but it's just a fantasy. So I wonder if there's a better way to measure this.
But you're suggesting that the physical healing of the biological earth would somehow be the redemption of the world soul?
Well, this is a motive for people to seek a world soul, and I would say the first attempt of most people now to resurrect the world soul is through the concept of Gaia and the integrity of the biosphere. But I don't think that's adequate, because even the dead moon has soul in the sense of a morphogenetic field as I described it at the beginning.
So it's a bridge out of matter into metaphysics, this task of saving the earth. It's as it were a ritual invocation of the world soul, which if carried out correctly might have the effect of bringing a connection to what is ultimately a metaphysical notion, the collectivity of all life in a non-physical dimension. This is what I'm hearing.
Yes, moving the metaphysical back to the top of the priority list.
The metaphysical and the physical are not so separate, are they? Because, as you rightly say, the best modern way we have of conceiving of the soul is through the concept of fields. And the history of science shows that the older ideas of souls, which were rejected in the 17th century, have been progressively replaced by newer concepts of fields, which take on most of the same jobs. The world soul, as Plotinus and Platonists usually understood it, I think was not so much to do with the earth as to do with the whole cosmos. The anima mundi was the soul of the world in the sense of the cosmos, not just the earth. But of course within that there were souls associated with the planets and all the heavenly bodies. So there were sub-souls, right down to animal souls, human souls and so on. There were lots of souls within souls. But to take just the cosmic one, the anima mundi, this was supposed to be an invisible organizing principle that held together the whole cosmos, keeping the stars in their place, the planets in their orbits and so on. Well, this was rejected by the mechanists of the 17th century, and it was introduced in the 1920s by Einstein, once again, in the form of the gravitational field, an invisible organizing principle that holds together the whole universe, keeps the stars in their places, the planets in their orbits, and so forth. In the 17th century, Gilbert, who did so much to found the modern understanding of magnetism, thought that the magnet pointed to the north because the magnet had a soul, following Thales and the whole tradition of Greek and subsequent Western thought, and that the Earth had a soul, which is what made the magnetic needle point to the North Pole. So we now call that a magnetic field, they called it a soul. And there are many ways in which the old understanding of the soul has been replaced by a new understanding of fields. And of course, the physical fields that are known to physicists are just part of the range of fields. There are other fields like morphogenetic fields as used in biology, which I interpret as morphic fields with an inherent memory, which are not yet part of conventional physics, but which may be part of the science of the future. So the field concept has been growing very rapidly since it was first introduced into science by Faraday in the 1840s. First in the realm of electricity and magnetism, then in the realms of gravity, then through quantum physics in the realm of quantum matter fields, in biology through morphic fields, and in various psychological field theories, starting with the Gestalt psychologists. So the soul can be conceived of in terms of fields in modern terms, and I think that this gives a very illuminating way of looking at many of the traditional doctrines of the soul.
Well, the world soul of the Neoplatonists, I admit it's confusing because the earth was interpreted as the whole world, but there was the celestial sphere and the terrestrial sphere, and in between there were, for all of the planets, the spheres that contained the orbit of that planet, and particularly the lunar sphere, the next one outside the Earth, was some kind of boundary. As you know, the world soul in that conception, geocentric conception, didn't extend quite to the celestial sphere. It was imagined more as a kind of elastic medium, or in fact field, filling the space between the celestial sphere and the terrestrial sphere. If we try to extend this concept of the world soul over the entire universe, then it engulfs the celestial sphere, then the celestial sphere becomes somehow less divine. We get the picture for which Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake Easter Sunday in the year 1600. His contradiction of the celestial sphere was actually the problem, as then it denied the throne of God. There was no location for God. So if we accept your view of the universal field, which I think is a good idea, then we also have to think of that as a kind of a modern improvement over the Platonic view of the world soul. That's good. Then that means that the mansion of God is somehow interpenetrating ordinary real estate as you want. But this field idea is probably older than Faraday. For example, the Samkhya philosophy, the Akash, the Tanmatras, and so on. In India, these were kind of field models for the world's soul and the entire great chain of being.